Good afternoon. On behalf of Hudson Institute, I would like to welcome all those who have joined us online and in person today to US-India relations in the Trump 2.0 era, challenges, opportunities, and the road ahead. This event is part of the Motwani Jadeja US-India Dialogue Series. I'm Aparna Pande, Director of the Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia. Founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn, Hudson challenges conventional thinking, seeks to guide policymakers and global leaders in government and business through a program of publications, conferences, policy briefings, and recommendations. Every American president since the 1990s has championed a strong US-India strategic partnership. And every Indian Prime Minister in the last 3 decades has pushed for a stronger relationship. Somebody reminded me that this month is the 25th anniversary of President Clinton's visit to India in March 2000. When President Donald Trump hosted Prime Minister Narendra Modi in February, the two democracies committed to doubling their bilateral trade, deepening their defense partnership, furthering cooperation in the realm of critical technologies. With shared democratic principles, deeply rooted people-to-people ties, US-India relations reflect a mutual commitment to advancing global prosperity and security. To discuss US relations with India, we are fortunate to have with us today, and I will embarrass him, someone I have admired and respected tremendously for some years. Dr. Ashley Tellis is the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, specializing in international security, US foreign and defense policy, with a special focus on Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Ashley is well known to all of you, so I will not share his entire bio. Dr. Tellis will offer his thoughts. We'll follow this with a moderated conversation and then turn to the audience for questions. Dr. Tellis, over to you.
Thank you, Aparna. It's a pleasure to be back here at Hudson. I've had the pleasure of knowing many scholars at Hudson over the years, and it's a real delight to see the remarkable contributions that Aparna, you have made to the study of India at Hudson. And of course, my old friend, Ambassador Haqqani, wherever he is at this point on the planet, do give him my best. When you see him, you'll have done a fabulous job. Aparna asked me to speak about the US-India relationship, and I thought it would be most productive today to offer a reflection looking backwards. Because to be very honest, I'm not confident I can offer you clear and concise judgments about what it's going to be looking forward. Except to say that I have a basic optimism that the relationship will do very well. But once you ask me to translate that basic optimism into granularity, my views on the subject are as good as anyone else's views in this room. We have many people here, actually, as I'm looking at you, who've been involved in the vineyards of this relationship for a long time. I see Don Camp, Alan Kronstadt, Nancy Jackson, people who have been involved in the making of this relationship over the last 25 years. But let me offer some thoughts as I look back in retrospect. I think the transformation of this relationship has been one of the great success stories of US foreign policy and Indian foreign policy. At a time when we sometimes despair about our capacities to achieve foreign policy successes, one ought to look at India as the exception that really tests that rule. Because we managed to take a relationship that was very prickly, that was very difficult, that at times was estranged, and build it into something where our complementarities have now begun to outweigh our differences. I do not want to pretend that the differences have disappeared. They haven't. But it's really a testament to the maturity of the leaderships in both countries that we can now discuss these differences with equanimity. And we recognize the limits of what our positions entail, and we look for ways to bridge those gaps between our policy positions when we don't have perfect convergence. And this is truly new. This is truly new, and I think it is the experience of the last 25 years that proves this quite clearly. I say this is a great success because we often forget how novel this strategic relationship is. And I want to emphasize that novelty because we are talking of two countries that are very large, with very proud histories, and which bring to this relationship very different circumstances and very different grand strategic aims. India is a new country. The US is much older in comparison. India is, for all intents and purposes, still a relatively poor country. The United States is a very wealthy country. India is still, in many ways, a new post-colonial state. The United States has forgotten what the experience of colonialism has been, and rightly so. And yet, to be able to bring these two countries together, despite these disparities, to my mind is actually nothing short of miraculous. But let me talk about a fundamental difference that we always ought to keep at the back of our minds because it goes to the core of many of the differences that we ought to recognize and sometimes even talk about. The United States is a country that is fundamentally in the business of protecting its own primacy. Every now and then we forget that and we deviate from it. But at least throughout the post-war period, the US has been in the business of protecting an order, an international order that serves its interests. India, in contrast, is a country that is fiercely dedicated to the idea of protecting its own independence. And sometimes the desire to protect that independence collides with the American interest in protecting its primacy. And this is seen very clearly in the differences in operational objectives. If you ask the current foreign minister of India, who is one of the most articulate exponents today on the global stage, he will tell you quite transparently that India's grand strategic ambition is, of course, to develop and become a country like the United States. But when it looks at the world, it wants to create a world which is characterized by multipolarity in Asia and multipolarity globally. The US, in contrast, is very agreeable to the idea of multipolarity in Asia because it serves our interests to have a multiplicity of powers. But I don't think we are very enthusiastic about the idea of having multipolarity globally. And because there is this fundamental divergence, it shows up in many ways in the nitty-gritty of the things that we have to negotiate. There's also another difference that we always ought to keep in mind. This is a relationship between two fundamentally different powers in terms of capability. In many ways, it is an asymmetric relationship. Now, diplomats are very polite, and we always want to testify to the truth of the sovereign equality between states. But the fact of the matter is, the United States is a very powerful country. And while India wants to aspire to become like the United States, it's not there yet. And that implies that India will always be, for the foreseeable future, far more dependent on the United States than the United States will be in reverse. And that too is a reality that we cannot forget if we are thinking about this relationship systematically and carefully. So, in the context of all these differences, right, how have we done in the last 25 years? I want to offer a few thoughts across 4 baskets of issues. The first is diplomatic cooperation. Irrespective of who has been in power in New Delhi or in Washington, since the year 2000, I think the quality of our diplomatic intercourse has simply been different from the decades that went before. It started in many ways with President Clinton setting the tone with that fabulous visit to India, which you referred to, Aparna. And then it has continued, irrespective of which occupant has been in the White House or which occupant has been on Racecourse Road. As I mentioned before, in our diplomatic engagement, there is a clear recognition that sometimes we are worlds apart. But we have not let those differences get in the way of productive cooperation whenever possible. And we've actually managed to pull that off with a remarkable degree of subtlety. Everyone knows that beneath or behind the US-India relationship are concerns that both countries have about China. Both countries have managed to maneuver in a way that immunizes them as best as possible vis-a-vis Chinese power and Chinese assertiveness. And yet we've managed to conduct our diplomacy in a way where we do not have to lead by waving the China flag every time we engage. We do much better bilaterally than we do multilaterally. I think that is something that we ought to acknowledge. And again, part of that is because of the status inconsistencies that describe our respective positions. The US is at the top of the heap. India is trying to claw its way up that heap. And so it's not surprising that particularly in multilateral fora, India either finds itself not adequately represented or finds that the positions that dominate multilateral institutions are positions that leave it at a disadvantage. And yet, despite those differences, we've actually managed to find cooperative ways to get things done. Not always perfectly, but still good enough. And in so doing, I think we've laid the foundation for the kind of cooperation that I hope will survive even as India grows to be a more powerful country in the decades to come. Look at the second basket, which is security cooperation. I think security cooperation has been a spectacular success, even though when you look at the details, the results are often mixed. If you look at the character of our defense consultations, they are simply remarkable. Whether the consultations take place between the uniformed branches of the services on both sides, or whether they take place between the political leaderships on both sides, the quality of our defense conversations have been absolutely remarkable. They have been consistent. They have taken place at extremely intense levels of engagement, and they are now virtually an autopilot. We don't have to make the effort, they just come. To my mind, the fact that we have actually been able to put into place a modest security architecture regionally through the Quad, through various other forms of bilateral engagement with other partners, the Japanese, the Australians, the Indonesians, and with other countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, is a very good sign. I don't want to overpromise because I think we still have a long ways to go to make certain that these institutions can actually deliver on the promise of cooperative security. But to imagine that India would participate in a minilateral that was not blessed by the United Nations 30 or 40 years ago is a remarkable piece of evidence as to how far we've come. Now, we have to admit that these institutions have done much better at the level of low politics, where it comes to economics, where it comes to global public goods, and so on and so forth. They've done less well at the levels of high politics. And that is partly because there are divergences in the aims of the four partners in the Quad. And there are very clear divergences in the aims between the United States and India, particularly with respect to that key power that is the catalyzing influence, and that is China. All the same, when you look more granularly at military-to-military cooperation, the kinds of things that both militaries have done, again, the transformation has simply been breathtaking. But there is an asterisk. And the asterisk is that even today, India is still uncomfortable with the idea of operational collaboration. India is still uncomfortable with the idea of genuine interoperability. Because most Indian policymakers believe that there will rarely, if ever, be a situation where India and the United States will have to work together in some challenging security circumstance. And therefore, India has been more careful about permitting its armed forces to collaborate as intimately with their US counterparts as the United States would like. A remarkable initiative has been in the area of defense trade and defense industrial collaboration. We still have a long ways to go. But again, that's because of the asymmetries that I described earlier. The Indian defense budget is a fraction of what the US defense budget is. When US primes go to India, they want to do big dollar business. India's budgets don't allow for that. And because India's budgets don't allow for that, the kind of activity that the primes can undertake in India is always far smaller than the Indian government would like. Now, there are no easy fixes to these kinds of problems, but the fact is we've now made the effort for the first time, not simply to buy things or sell things, but to actually build some things together. I don't want to pretend that this is going to be the last word on the subject, but the fact that we have taken baby steps at least opens the door to cooperation that I hope will have no finite ending. You already see that, for example, in proposals to build armored personnel vehicles, in proposals to build anti-tank weapons, and so on and so forth. So I think we are still at the earliest stages of what the fruits of full defense industrial collaboration will bring, but it's been a great start. And the fact that this is happening between two countries that have radically different defense capabilities and have radically different resources that they pour into defense is really a testament to the emphasis that both leaderships have placed on making certain that they can chalk out wins. Third basket, technology cooperation. We've taken small but very important steps. If you look at the checklist of activities that came under the rubric of ISET, now replaced by US-India Trust with a tongue-twisting name, I have to read this, transforming the relationship using strategic technologies. That's long-winded. But it is hopeful because the elements in that portfolio of programs is truly cutting edge. Now, I will wait to see how successful we are in actually delivering on the programs of ISET or Trust. And the reason I say I'll wait to see is because this is not industrial age stuff. We are talking of artificial intelligence. We are talking of advanced computation. We are talking of the manufacturing of advanced semiconductors. We are talking of space. Now, these are all sectors which are sunrise sectors in the global economy. And the United States has a vested interest in dominating these sectors and making certain that nobody else catches up with us. Now, how we are going to be able to reconcile this objective with the idea of actually sharing these technologies, even with a good friend as India is something that we will have to wait and see. But I think it's a good faith effort on the part of both nations to actually walk down this road. And we will see what this brings. Last basket, economic cooperation. I have to admit that this is the one area where we have done far too poorly. And we've done far too poorly because India, I think, still cannot bring itself to think of the United States as being an economic partner, because it sees the United States as essentially at the cutting edge of the global economy. It sees the United States as actually being able to throw large sectors of the Indian economy out of work if the US enjoys the kind of market access that the US seeks. And therefore, India has become, or has been, very shy about opening its markets and expanding trade in the way that we would have liked to see that expansion. Now, President Trump has promised to bring a sledgehammer to this problem and has already brought a sledgehammer to the problem. And maybe this is one area where a sledgehammer might actually work. I don't know. I'll keep my fingers crossed. But if we can actually get to the objective of having $500 billion in trade by 2030, I think that would be an amazing transformation. We'll have to see what the details actually bring. But the fact of the matter is, if India is to realize its own ambitions to become a developed economy by the year 2047, the history of the post-war period has taught us one thing. You cannot do that without access to external markets. You cannot do that without improving your export performance. And the moment you talk about improving export performance, it's almost a natural law of economics. You cannot improve export performance without permitting expanded imports, because the two go together. And so if India is serious about reaching that 2047 ambition of being a developed country, it means it will have to move from its trend growth rate level of about 6% to a trend growth level of 8% or more. And there is no way you get those marginal 2 percentage points more if India does not open its markets. And so it is in that context that the complementarities between the Indian economy and the US economy will actually be most fruitfully seen if India can take those steps. Now, a series of presidents, including the one that I served a long time ago, President Bush, attempted to coax India into opening those markets, but without great success. The current occupant of the White House has decided that it's time to take the axe to the roots and solve the problem in more dramatic ways. Now, the Prime Minister has promised that he is going to look very carefully at the things that India must do with respect to tariff reduction, with respect to addressing the challenges of non-tariff barriers, and so on and so forth. And I believe that if we can make gains in those two areas, then the door will be opened for a more productive synergy between the US and the Indian economy. It will help the United States some, but the US is such a gigantic economy and our dependence on global trade is relatively so small that at the end of the day, it will help India far more than it helps the United States. And so I hope India has the courage to take those steps and move in that direction, because at the end of the day, it will be good for both of us. So when you sort of do a net assessment across all these four baskets and ask yourself where the relationship is today, I think you can, without any threat of controversy, say that we are in a very good place. But, and there's always a but, right? The bilateral relationship is great in itself it will get better. I have no doubts about that. But we have to ask ourselves two rather difficult and sometimes embarrassing questions. The first is, are these activities that the governments on both sides are putting enormous effort into, are these activities making a fundamental difference in accelerating the accumulation of power in India and the United States? Because at the end of the day, these activities that we are engaged in are not designed simply to keep our bureaucracies at work. These activities are designed to essentially build up our national capabilities. And we have to ask ourselves whether all the efforts of the last 25 years have paid off in very concrete terms with respect to accelerating national power. I would say the jury is still out on that one. And then there's a second question that we ought to ask ourselves. Is this coming closer together, which again has been on clear display for the last 25 years, has this made a palpable difference in terms of limiting either China's growth and power or limiting China's assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific? Because again, at the end of the day, we have been engaged in this remarkable exercise of building these new bonds, not simply for the sake of it, although that is important in its own right, but because we want to maintain, as Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice once said, a balance of power that favors freedom. We want to be able to create outcomes in the Indo-Pacific that are favorable to our collective interests. And so when I ask myself whether the efforts we've made have paid off in terms of either checking China's rise in power or limiting its assertiveness, I draw a blank. Or at least I cannot confidently say yes right now. And if the answers to both these questions are still uncertain, then I think for all the achievements of the last 25 years, we have a huge agenda of things yet to be done when we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the transformation of this relationship. So thank you very much.
Thank you for, I would say, realist and also provocative opening remarks. So I'll draw on some of the strands that you laid out and ask a few questions before we go to the audience. Let me start with, sort of a question which is on the minds of people here, but was in Delhi when I was last week. So you are co-editor of the annual Strategic Asia volume. You write on strategy. India is historically preferred, and you mentioned this, a multipolar world. And the US preference historically has been to ensure American primacy. In the context of the first, I would say, 2 months of the current administration, feels longer, and the current geopolitical churn that we are witnessing, where do you see the current administration and the US-India relationship going? And I would say in the near term, I'm not talking about the next 25 years, but just the near term. Do you see, you mentioned that you were positive about the US-India relationship. Despite the geopolitical churn and everything that's happening, are you still positive about the next few months, I would say, of the US-India relationship under this administration?
So I think the broad trend, as I emphasized, will be positive because even an administration that is as tumultuous as that of President Trump, I think he recognizes, the administration recognizes, that the relationship with India is important given our wider objectives. But I think the fact that this administration has still not settled down in terms of what its priorities are and what its core trajectory is going to be, that's what creates the uncertainties. And I think those uncertainties will persist we would be lucky if they persisted for just a few months. I think they're likely to persist for a lot longer. And that is naturally going to raise the question of how does one build this relationship and carry it forward? I don't know today what the grand strategic objective of the Trump administration is. I understand the desire to make America great again. But what does that translate into? Does making America great again mean protecting a global order that serves our interests? The president seems to be disinclined to buy into that vision. Does it mean protecting the hemisphere and the hemisphere alone? Many members of the administration give the impression that that's the underlying strategy. And if it is, it would be nice to hear it, because there are implications of that strategy, not only for countries like India, but also for our allies, like our European partners or the Japanese. So if hemispheric defense is what we are gravitating towards, what does that mean in the details? My sense is that it will be a while before we get clarity on some of these questions. And so we must be prepared for uncertainties for quite some time to come.
Thank you. So you mentioned this in your two buts towards the end, the China factor. We have witnessed the rise of China, at the same time the deepening India-US partnership over the last 25 years. Around 1.5 years ago, in 2023, you wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs in which you argued for the need to be clear-eyed about how far US and India would ever be aligned on China, and that India was unlikely to be like any traditional American ally. If I ask you to re-examine that article in today's world, sort of, and the priorities as of now of the second Trump administration, sort of, what do you see as the future of the Indo-Pacific strategy, Quad, and India-US relationships vis-a-vis China today?
I wish I could answer that question with any confidence. I think the conclusion that I argued in the Foreign Affairs piece, I think holds quite robustly. The United States, because it is such a powerful country, has the luxury of adopting confrontational policies with China. It can adopt those confrontational policies with relatively low cost to itself. Not without costs, there will always be costs, but at relatively lower costs to itself. India is much weaker than the United States. India also happens to be much weaker than China. And India happens to be located in uncomfortable proximity to China. And so India's freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis China is much less compared to that of the United States. And that was the essential point of the piece. The essential point of the piece was, if you expect that India will simply tag along and play the role that we would like all allies to play in the achievement of our objectives vis-a-vis China, we might be disappointed, because India does not have either the latitude or the luxury to play that role. So on that fundamental point, I have no reason to resile from the argument I made some time ago. But this only begs the question, and the question to my mind today, for which I don't have a good answer, and you will discover that I will say many times this afternoon that I don't have a good answer, is I don't know what our policy towards China is going to be. I think the first Trump administration was actually quite instructive, and not in the best sense. We had an Indo-Pacific policy, but I don't think the Indo-Pacific policy was the president's policy. I think it was the administration's policy. So you had a Trump administration that had a very clear vision of what an Indo-Pacific strategy ought to be like. And they articulated that very clearly in several documents, and they actually executed it. But I think the president had a much more iconoclastic view about the Indo-Pacific. And I think he was much more open to the idea of reaching some kind of a rapprochement with China, which was probably not shared by many of the officials who talked about an Indo-Pacific strategy in his name. And so today, I'm left with the same degree of uncertainty. Will the second Trump administration provide evidence that the president is wedded to the strategy that he articulated many years ago? Or are we going to see a new kind of engagement where the president moves in a certain direction and his administration moves in some other? I think this is the question that's certainly on the mind of all our Asian allies at this point. And only time will bring an answer. And it may bring uncomfortable answers for which we need to brace ourselves.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the security and defense partnership and what it has achieved. And I believe it's the 20th year of the 2005 defense agreement that the two countries signed. It has become the strongest peg at some level of this relationship in the last 15 to 20 years. Again, the context of an administration that is keen that partners and allies share burden, and an India that is insistent on maintaining strategic autonomy or not sort of, as of now, not joining any security alliances. You mentioned the difficulties of interoperability, even though there's deeper mill-to-mill cooperation. Where sort of, where do you see cooperation growing in the India-US defense partnership in this Trump administration? Will it be defense sales because there's a commercial element to it? Will it be defense co-production and collaboration? And I ask this because we have all lived through DTTI, which sort of some of the current projects actually date back to that part. So which element do you see as moving forward? And my second part to this also is, you mentioned China and the fact that the president is trying for a deal, if possible, in the June summit. If that happens, will the security partnership remain as important? Because India may not see that as something which is beneficial for India.
So I think both sides are committed to renewing the defense framework agreement. I think sometime in this year, you will see a new version of that defense framework agreement being signed. The question is not going to be the agreement itself, but its implementation. What I think you will see consistent performance on is going to be in the pure mill-to-mill activity, because the militaries are professional on both sides. They have an agenda of things they want to get to do together, and they will execute without any hiccups. To me, the questions are going to be bigger. The Prime Minister, I know, is deeply interested in defense industrial cooperation. He wants the best American technology to be absorbed by the Indian Armed Forces. But he wants that to be the foundation on which his Make in India program is erected. I don't see President Trump as being enthusiastic about the possibility of manufacturing abroad if there is an alternative of manufacturing at home. And so at some point, the two ambitions, if they don't collide, they're certainly going to sort of butt up against one another. And we'll have to see how those problems get negotiated away. There's also another reality we have to recognize. When India purchases defense items, it generally purchases them in very small numbers. And the economics simply don't allow manufacturing those small numbers at alternative sites in India to be economical. And so at some point, I think India will have to make up its mind on whether it wants maximum bang for the buck in terms of making its defense dollars go farther, or whether it's prepared to accept higher unit costs because it insists on manufacturing those small numbers of items in India. This has been a constant tussle over the last 20 years in India. And India has always come down on the side of accepting the inconveniences but manufacturing in India. As long as you did not have a president who was equally determined to manufacture in the US, the only consequences were economic. Now I think those consequences will bleed into the political, and we shall have to see how they get reconciled.
So you mentioned this in your speech, the convergences have deepened. There are either divergence and those will remain based on different geographies, different histories. And so if we come to the part of the world which matters at some level the most to India, its own neighborhood, US and India have often diverged, sort of had different views on almost all of India's neighbors, but especially India's neighbors to the west, Pakistan. Recent past, even Bangladesh. Considering that in President Trump's State of the Union, he referred to Pakistan and thanked Pakistan, and India was called out for tariffs. Where do you see this administration's South Asia policy going? And do you see any possible divergences between US and India on how US adopts a policy towards any of India's neighbors, especially Pakistan?
Let me put it as bluntly as possible, right? If India expects the United States to simply subcontract its regional policy in the subcontinent to India, it's not going to happen. Because the United States has independent relationships with all the countries on India's periphery. Now, I don't think this administration is going to double down on the relationships with India's smaller neighbors to the neglect of the relationship with India. But I think it will pursue its interests where its interests lead. And in that sense, it's not going to be doing anything different compared to what previous administrations had done. Even the Biden administration maintained a relationship with Bangladesh that India was uncomfortable about. It would have preferred to maintain a decent relationship with Pakistan if the Pakistanis didn't get in the way. So in that sense, I don't think Trump is going to do anything that is fundamentally different. This is an area where I think there will be adjustments only because I don't see the Trump administration as making South Asia outside of India a major US priority. But even within that framework, I think we will pursue our interests. And you saw the decisions that were made about, the supply of spares for F-16s and so on and so forth. And I think those decisions are justified decisions in many ways, and they will continue. But none of this should take away from the fact that when any administration official looks at the subcontinent, there's one country that towers above everything else. And nothing in our policy is going to be constructed on the premise that that is not true.
So one more question and then I'll open it up to the audience. You talked about this in your remarks that, the bilateral relationship is good. It's grown over the last 35 years. And, India is proud, Indians are proud that India retains bipartisan consensus within the American policy system. And the first few weeks of the Trump administration shows that consensus remains. However, and I will put you on the spot here, someone who has followed this relationship for over 3 decades, do you foresee any reason for this bipartisan consensus to face a challenge? Is it a possibility that that something will happen in this bilateral relationship which will hurt this bipartisan consensus?
That is something that I deeply fear. And I deeply fear that this bipartisan consensus that has brought us over the last 30-odd years will fray for 2 reasons. One, there are developments in India's domestic politics which are creating complications as they intersect with the political spectrum in the United States. problems we did not have 30 years ago. And second, the extent of polarization in our own country is now so acute that nothing is immune to that polarization anymore. So it is entirely possible that we could reach a point where one political party uses developments in India to embarrass its competition across the aisle. And that is equally true in India as well. So I think, both countries need to make a real effort to protect what has been most valuable about this. And if we just end up doing things that are terribly short-sighted because of the immediate gains, sacrificing the larger interest, I think we will both come out short. But this is a risk today in a way that I didn't have reason to fear 20 years ago.
Thank you. And I told the audience, please raise your hand and then wait for the mic, and please introduce yourself with a name and affiliation right up front.
Hi, thank you. I'm Alan Kronstaff, Congressional Research Service, and I wanted to follow on something with this last question, looking at domestic politics. I can also say that if Ashley Tellis starts an answer with "I don't know," I'll take it as a good answer. In any case, the BJP is the world's largest political party, hundreds of millions of members, home to some pretty visceral and vehement nationalist views that include religious nationalist views. And within that, there's, resentments of the United States, distrust of the United States. So recently we've seen a conviction that the US was, oversaw the removal of Sheikh Hasina or was providing $21 million in aid, apparently false claim, to get out the vote for Congress. Or returning migrants in shackles in the plane. So, I'm curious, beneath the calm surface of the current leadership in New Delhi, what might come of, after Modi, like, for instance, a Prime Minister Amit Shah or Prime Minister Yogi, could that, change India's position and relationship with the US? Thanks.
I mean, it's a difficult question, Alan, in part because some things have changed and some things haven't, right? What has changed? What has changed is that the leadership in India has become very cognizant of the importance of a good relationship with the United States. And I would say ever since Prime Minister Vajpayee, that has been almost an article of faith in Indian foreign policy. What has not changed is that despite the transformation in the views of the leadership, the Indian political spectrum is still diverse enough and still has important constituencies that are deeply skeptical of the United States. That has not changed. So when the going is good, everyone is content to be a cheerleader. But the moment you get the first sign of fractiousness, these constituencies that never quite trusted the US to begin with will begin to articulate their grievances. And we've seen this at so many points in the last 20-odd years. You remember the instance when we had a case of the Indian diplomat, right? And you saw the upsurge in nationalism in India among groups that simply pilloried the United States. Again, rightly or wrongly is not, something we need to discuss now. But I think there is a diversity of opinion there. And I simply think we should not expect that just because the leadership is making realist calculations about the US importance to India, the rank and file in their parties will simply follow suit. So we just have to recognize that this is part of the landscape and hope that leaders will be able to exercise some influence on their own constituents to the degree that they are their own constituents and moderate the worst of these impulses. But like in any democracy, right, we've been spared this in the US only because India is largely not that consequential to the rank and file of the American people. But if India were to become that significant, I could imagine Americans having different views about India as well. So, this is the messiness of having large and diverse countries trying to build something new. And you just manage it as best you can. It's not going to disappear.
Over there, Donald Camp.
Hi, I'm Don Camp, retired Foreign Service officer. Thank you, Ashley, for a wonderful presentation. I was struck afterward in this conversation when you referred to the Trump 1 and the bureaucracy versus a Trump who you described as iconoclastic, which is a very diplomatic way of putting it. I would put it a little more cynically and say transactional and all the other things that we know Trump is capable of. So when you demurred from talking about Trump 2 and what might happen, isn't it likely that we'll see a continuation of Trump 1, a bureaucracy that follows the bipartisan consensus and writes the joint statements when Trump goes to India later this year and pursues advances in security cooperation and so forth, and Trump, who has decided that Modi is one of these leaders that he can really embrace, a strong man that he can identify with, that they will have a dialogue, and the last thing he hears from Modi will be an initiative that no one in the bureaucracy has ever thought of. And I don't know when the next crisis with Pakistan or China or whatever, we will have the Modi-Trump consensus that may be a divergence from current policy. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think, given the structure of the administration, both in the first term and what could happen in the second term, we have to consider that this is a real possibility, that the president will pursue a policy that he prefers, that he invests in, including with his counterpart, while the rest of the government essentially marches to the beat of another drummer, right? We have to simply accept that this is an outcome that would not surprise us if it did occur. I see one advantage in this otherwise sort of disconcerting story. And the one advantage is that if the president does invest in a personal relationship with his counterpart, then that investment could pay off in terms of getting his counterpart to do things that advance US interests. And that would be a good thing. It could also pay off in terms of an investment that the president could use in the event of a crisis, because he shares a certain sympathy with his fellow leader. And that's not something to entirely discount, right? Because South Asia is crisis prone. You never know when those relationships, come in handy. So I guess we ought to hope that if there is such a divergence between the president and the administration, that at least the equities he invests in with respect to his counterpart are real and sustaining. Because if they are real and sustaining, they may yet deliver from the vantage point of US interests, right? Fingers crossed on that count.
Right on the front row.
Thanks, Ashley, as always. Fascinating conversation. I completely agree with you that one of the big successes is that over the years we've managed to build this relationship despite the frictions. And one of those frictions was Russia. And you didn't talk at all about Russia, and I'm wondering what you make of, or what the Indians make of kind of the Trump administration's kind of somewhat rapprochement with Putin, and what does that mean for the kind of no barriers partnership with China? How does this all filter into their calculus in terms of their geostrategic interests?
I think India sees a glimmer of hope in Trump's outreach to Russia and specifically Putin. And the glimmer of hope that they see is that to the degree that the US and Russia reach greater convergence, they think the pressures on India, which they faced under President Biden, will be eased somewhat. Because you know this all too well, Nancy, the Indians were trying to persuade us that we ought to have a policy of rapprochement with Russia in the hope of peeling Russia away from China. Because the real object of Indian interest is China, with Russia being the means to managing the China challenge. Now, it's not clear to me that Russia is, in fact, available to be peeled, no matter what we do. But to the degree that we are attempting to do something like that, I think the Indians see room for hope. Now, this hope may run, a shoal rough grounds, right? But I think at the moment, they're willing to let this sort of initiative play itself out and see where it ends up. But I think the long and short of the calculation is, if the US and Russia begin to see each other as something other than mortal enemies, that's good for India. And if that results in a diminished Russian reliance on China, that's good for India too. I think both these dyads, though, are structurally infirm. And I'm not sure, given Putin's view of the West, and I don't know what he thinks of President Trump, but I do have a sense of what he thinks about the United States. And he doesn't wish us well, and he doesn't think that we are a good friend to Russia. So given that fact, his incentives to walk away from China, to my mind, are very, very small, if at all. And so if I were Putin, I would play the United States for everything it's worth. I would give the President of the United States the impression that I'm willing to look for a new relationship, even as I keep my own powder dry, even as I keep my relationship with Russia as tight as I possibly can. And if the President of the United States is comfortable with both those realities, then Putin comes home the winner. And that is what I expect we will see in the next few months in the US-Russia relationship.
So one question is all I can take. The gentleman sitting in the third row.
Hi, Atharva Sharma from the University of Maryland. Thank you again, Dr. Tellis, for the fascinating talk. So I actually wanted to ask you about the third basket, which was technology cooperation. So as you said, the US wants to maintain its dominant position as the leader of technology in the world. So do you see any area in technology cooperation where the US can actually help accelerate this ambition by working with India? Or do you think, in general, like in most industries, the US would want to keep the industry as homegrown as possible?
It's a tough question, because when I talk about the US maintaining its primacy in the area of high technology, that's a very abstract argument, right? Other things being equal, of course, we want to be the best. And we want to make certain that everybody else comes a poor second. But primacy has many dimensions, one of which is maintaining our resilience. And when you think of resilience as being an important dimension of protecting your primacy, then you may discover that you cannot preserve resilience if you are not willing to distribute the capacity to manufacture these technologies along a wider swath of countries than just the United States. I mean, ideally, the United States would manufacture all these technologies and everybody else would come with a begging bowl. But we know that there is technology diffusion in the system. Countries have their own capacities. So the issue for the United States is, when do you pursue primacy exclusively through the strategy of domesticating these capabilities and domesticating only, versus countenancing some distribution of these capabilities to other countries because you're confident in your relationship with those countries. And my argument would be that for many technologies, there will be room to distribute manufacturing capability, to distribute R&D capabilities across national boundaries among partners who are basically friendly to the United States. And there will, of course, be some leading edge technologies that we would not want to see anyone have, including our allies. And those, of course, are the crown jewels that the United States will protect and should protect. But anything that is less than the crown jewel, if we can protect our interests in resiliency, protect our interests in access, make certain that our allies are also lifted by being able to co-produce, co-develop, co-manufacture, that's a win-win for both of us, and I think that's what we ought to pursue. So the devil is in the details, and I think that will break down technology by technology, sector by sector.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and Dr. Tellis for coming here today. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.